Chapter 23. Reuben continued to watch in stunned silence as his village burned, and his men were helpless to do anything. The enemy below had been sacking and carousing and laughing, scoffing at the castle that overlooked the village. Eventually they had left, apparently to sleep on the outskirts of the city. King Melchizedek himself had watched for some time from the balcony, but he too had turned into his throne room. Reuben's guards relaxed their bows but stood ready. A guard interrupted his thoughts. "Sir, the princess!" "Wait," Reuben said. There amongst the burning ruins walked the gilded monster, the dragon from the throne room called Mammon. It surveyed the scene and turned its eyes to meet the gaze of Reuben on the wall. For a moment they watched each other, staring intently into each other's eyes, as if a message were somehow being communicated between them. Reuben saw the potential for the kingdom. Even Joab had argued with Melchizedek. This Mammon, this was their hope. He offered economic stability, wealth even, the opportunity for a real peace and prosperity. Why was the king so unmoving, so stubborn, unwilling to share the kingdom? And now, most of the kingdom, and indeed most of the enemy, were sleeping, yet the unspoken dialogue between the guard and the dragon continued. Reuben realized that the authority was his. He could open the gates to the dragon and tell his guards to stand down and effectively create an alliance between the two armies. He had been entrusted with the mission of protecting the kingdom and serving the king. It would clearly be in the best interest of the kingdom to create an alliance. And to serve the king? Well, certainly some provisions must be made if the king is not in his right mind or is unable to rule. In fact, someone should rule in his place. Reuben suddenly realized that as head of the guards, he was in the unique position of deciding who would rule the kingdom. He could not only let the dragon in. If he and his guards pledged allegiance to the dragon, this would officially make the dragon their king. All this passed between them unspoken. Behind the dragon, the early light of dawn began to illuminate the sky. Again the guard spoke. "Sir, you delay too long. The princess will not live." Reuben looked at his guard, then at the others who watched him, and seemed to know what he was thinking. Mammon stood in the village, patiently, watching, waiting. Reuben gave him an almost imperceptible nod, then turned to the guard. "Bring me to her," Reuben said. Jeroboam left Solomon's chamber and went to seek help. He soon found Daniel, who was meditating rather than sleeping. Jeroboam interrupted Daniel's meditation and told him the news. Despite the fact that Solomon and Deborah had been among Daniel's closest friends, he merely nodded and said, "We must tell the king." Together, Daniel and Jeroboam went to the king's chambers. Miriam was there, as was the girl Magdalena, but the king was not. "He's in the throne room," Miriam whispered, so as not to awaken the sleeping Magdalena. "Thank you, your highness," Daniel said, then led the way to the throne room. At the entrance to the throne room, two tired-looking guards suddenly stood at attention as Daniel and Jeroboam approached. "Is the king alone?" Daniel asked. The guards indicated that he was. "Good. I must speak with him immediately."
He asked not to be disturbed,"
one of the guards said.
"I understand, but I am a member of his council, and there is pressing news which must be brought to his attention."
Then to Jeroboam, Daniel added,
"You better wait here."
Daniel was admitted into the throne room, which was dimly lit, and he could immediately see the king on his throne. However, Daniel was surprised to hear voices speaking quietly as if in council. What council could be formed if he was not there, and Solomon and Deborah were dead? He noted that there were others in the room, on all sides of the king. The others stopped talking as Daniel entered, and though they did not turn to look at him, they continued to look at the king. Daniel felt strongly that they must somehow be able to see him. Daniel stopped short when he realized that those with the king were not human, but great winged creatures. There were 4 of them. For a moment he had the astonishing thought that they may be dragons. Could it be that the king was consulting with dragons? "Come forward, Daniel," the king said. As Daniel approached, he could see that the creatures were not dragons, though they were the size of dragons. Each creature was, in fact, utterly unique from the other 3. Each one had 6 wings, and though the wings did not flap, they remained stationary, Each one flew. In some ways, they were like animals familiar to Daniel. This one like a lion, that like a calf, that like an eagle, and the fourth like a man. And yet all the while they were completely unlike anything he had seen. Next to them, the whole castle, the throne, the very battle they were discussing, seemed like passing mists. Only the king himself seemed more material than they. Daniel had the sense that not only could they see him without looking at him, but in fact they could see all around, and moreover they could see through him. He felt that each creature perceived him to his deepest self, even to a level that he did not know. "What have you come to tell us?" Melchizedek asked. Daniel dared not ask who the guests were, but said,
"Solomon and Deborah are dead, as is Asherah, whom they were battling."
A half-truth, but he did not feel the need to clarify the circumstances of their deaths. Indeed, he felt that they already knew. Nonetheless, he could see that the deaths grieved the king. "Thank you, Daniel. Is that all?" the king asked.
"Yes, sir, that is all."
And with that, Daniel turned and left the mysterious creatures with his king. He closed the door quietly behind him, listening for the click. Outside the throne room, Jeroboam looked at Daniel to see what he thought. But Daniel only said,
"Go, bury the bodies, and destroy the pole."
Then Daniel went to his own chamber. When Reuben entered the guard room near the end of Hezekiahs Tunnel, Tobias jumped to his feet and said, "Finally!"
"Do you know this man?"
Ratzes asked Reuben.
"I do indeed," Reuben answered. "Moreover, I know the girl. She is the princess that had been missing. We must get her help immediately."
Ratzes looked uneasy.
I sent for you and Deborah some time ago." "I'm aware of that. No one seems to know where Deborah is. However, this is the king's daughter. I suggest we bring her to the king."
"I don't think it's safe to move her," Tobias said. "Perhaps it is best if we bring the king to her."
"I don't want to compromise the secrecy of the location of this tunnel," Reuben answered. "This kingdom is full of traitors. Of course, the king himself knows, but I don't think we can bring him here without drawing additional attention."
For a moment, no one said anything. Finally, Reuben said,
"This is the king's daughter. He has not seen her for some time now. Of course, we'll have to bring him here."
"Sir," a guard interrupted.
"The sun is rising, sir, and it is believed that the battle will begin in the morning. Should the king really be taken from his duties?" "We will hold off their attacks. The king can choose what he will choose. Meanwhile, send a messenger to the king and queen and let them know that their daughter is here. Send another messenger to Deborah and yet another to Eli so that they can tend to Sarah. Tobias,"
here Reuben faltered, realizing that he may be addressing his future king.
"Tobias, you may stay here with Sarah if you wish. Ratzes, you're in charge. See to it that whoever needs access to this room is granted it, and yet do not give away its location."
With that, Reuben returned to his post on the wall. Within moments, the king rushed into the room, followed shortly thereafter by the queen. Miriam began to weep as she saw her daughter and knelt beside her cot. Melchizedek turned to Tobias.
"You've done well, my son."
"Thank you, your majesty," Tobias answered. "Will she live?" But the king did not answer his question. A few moments later, Eli rushed into the room, bringing with him a young girl from his special operations team. Eli looked flustered. He turned to Melchizedek. "Sir," he said, "Deborah is dead."
"I know," Melchizedek said. "Tend to my daughter, please."
"I am not a medic," Eli began, "but I've brought with me this girl. She's been effective in the power of Moriah for healing."
"She cannot be here," Ratzes said. "I don't know how she got past the guards, but no one should be here but officials and guards."
The king ignored him.
"What is your name, child?"
"Tabitha," the girl answered.
"Well, Tabitha, place your hands upon my daughter, and by the power of Moriah, heal her."
"Your Highness," Ratzes said, "if there is indeed healing power, surely you yourself could use it, or Eli. Why this little girl?"
But at that moment the girl touched Sarah, whose eyes opened. The color returned to her, and she sat up, pain-free though a little dazed. There was great joy in the reunion then of Sarah and her parents, tears and kisses. Tobias too was welcomed into the celebrations. Eli and Tabitha quietly left, while Ratzes was left speechless to observe. The joyous moment was soon interrupted by the sounds of trumpets and yelling from above and outside. Melchizedek turned to his wife. "Miriam," he said, "take Sarah back to our chambers and introduce her to her new sister. Tobias, come with me." Chapter 24. After what had been a fitful sleep at best, the people within the castle were awakened to the sound of trumpets outside the walls. Men scrambled to their feet, grabbing their weapons and forming ranks under Joab and Gideon, while the women and children were led by Jeroboam deeper into the castle where they could be protected. Reuben stood on top of the wall near the gates, from which vantage point he could see the armies both inside and outside the wall. 2 men were ready to raise the gate when ordered. Melchizedek and Tobias stood on the balcony overlooking the whole scene. They were soon joined by Daniel, Miriam, Sarah, and Magdalena. Sarah had recognized Magdalena as the girl who had tormented her in the dragon's camp, but she was grateful to have this girl as a sister now. In the courtyard, among the soldiers, were Eli's special operations, children and elderly and invalids, who would also fight by the power of Moriah. Outside the castle, the enemies were forming ranks, ready to attack. Sanballat was riding his horse, giving instructions to the commanders under him. They had left a wide avenue down the middle of their ranks, and rather than face the wall, they faced towards the avenue. Behind the men were the machines of war, catapults and trebuchets, loaded and ready to fire. The trumpet sounded again, this time announcing a procession. The 4 great giants marched down the avenue, armed with clubs that had clearly been entire trees that had been uprooted. They marched down the center aisle, then turned to take up posts along the wall. Behind them came a parade of dragons, 6 of them in total. A 7th dragon, Ra, flew in circles overhead, observing the procession. The others were led by Mammon, and the last of the dragons was Dagon, and on his back rode Jezebel. Behind Dagon came the statue of Molech, being dragged on rollers by men, and the furnace within its belly being stoked. Here and there among the dragons were Mazakim, though the vast majority of them had been killed in the earlier battle. Inside the castle, the people were terrified as they realized that they were outranked by the men alone, not even taking into account the weapons, dragons, and giants. The giants stood tall over the walls. Reuben's archers did not know who to aim at, the people below or the giants above. It was evident that their arrows would have no real effect on the giants, and that besides, the giants could easily reach and kill them with their hands. The very walls on which they stood would be knocked down within a matter of moments by their clubs. All of this confirmed the sheer foolishness of fighting in the mind of Reuben. He looked down at Joab in the court, who nodded his support. His men were ready. Suddenly, one of the giants noticed Sarah on the balcony. Pointing his massive finger, he said in a deep, sleepy-sounding voice, "The princess!" At this, confusion swept over Sanballat's men. Unanswered questions about where Sarah was being kept, the disappearance of Molech and Holofernes. These things caused a great distrust among the men towards the dragons. Ra saw that he would have to act quickly to maintain order in the men on his side of the wall. He landed on one of the castle towers, from where most people could see him. "People of Moriah," he spoke loudly, "we have offered your king peace and prosperity. You have responded with deceit. You've abducted our ambassador, who I now see standing beside the king as though she were a princess. Moreover, your own princess came to us, willingly, because she understood that we could bring enlightenment to you. And now I see that she is back with the king, prisoner like our ambassador. We've demonstrated to you our power. What we have done to your village, we will do to you and your kingdom, unless your king makes a pact with us. We will not send more ambassadors to you, for reasons that should be obvious. We are not your enemy, but partners. We have come here to free you from a tyrant. If he will instill the dragons as his advisors, and allow us to share a rule over the kingdom, then we shall do so. But so far he has not. He has banished us from the kingdom by force into inhospitable lands.
Your king has a choice before him. We offer him one last time a gift, a queen, who, if he marries, will mark the union of our kingdoms."
As he said this, he motioned to Jezebel sitting on the back of Dagon. She cackled more than laughed and held a goblet of red wine in mock toast to the king. Sanballat's men quietly laughed among themselves. She was drunk and hysterical, and even less attractive than usual. Miriam took Melchizedek's arm.
"Do you accept our offer, O king?"
Ra asked. When there was no response, he added,
"Then I turn to you, the people. Avert this bloodbath which is upon you. You know you will lose. Fight for us, and we will be merciful to you when we have established our rule. Fight against us, and even those who survive, few though they be, will become enemies of the state, and will taste the fate we have endured these many years. The decision falls to you now. Open your gates to us."
Then Ra looked to Reuben on the wall. Reuben in turn looked to Joab, who nodded his head gravely. Reuben gave the order, and the great metal gate began to be raised. Outside, the men cheered at the easy victory. Ra left his post to take his place among his fellow dragons in the procession that would enter the courtyard. But when the gate was only raised halfway, Joab yelled, "Now!" The army of Moriah was charging out the gate and into the wide avenue. The archers on the walls began felling Sanballat's men.
"The dragons!" Reuben shouted. "Get the dragons!"
Arrows deflected off the dragons' scaly backs without harming them, but here was one shot in the wing, unable to take flight. Another was shot in the eye and flew blindly over the walls, where his soft underbelly was vulnerable. Dagon seemed unable to fly, and he turned and thrashed, trying to get the woman off his back, but she clung ever harder to his throat. Finally, he turned his mighty head and bit her in half before he took to the air. Reuben himself managed to shoot Mammon in the throat, and the great lizard's carcass fell upon the soldiers below. Joab and his men had charged into the avenue, such that they were extremely vulnerable in the crossfire between the two sides of the enemy army. They had left the security of the walls, but had brought the battle to where the enemy was, instead of waiting. This caused great confusion amongst the enemy's men, who had prepared for a siege. It also neutralized the giants, who suddenly could not identify their own side from their opponents, but swung their clubs mercilessly through the crowds. The archers took aim at the giants with the arrows, which felt to the giants like a barrage of pinpricks. The giants thrashed all the more wildly, one of them knocking over a whole tower, sending it and the archers poised in it falling to the field below. One of Eli's boys was a shepherd, and he took a stone and flung it from a sling. Incredibly, the stone embedded itself in the giant's forehead, who swayed and fell onto many of Sanballat's soldiers. In a rage, one of the other giants looked around to see who had killed his brother. He saw at the back of Sanballat's ranks the catapults and trebuchets, which were now armed and begun to fire on the castle. He ran to the nearest trebuchet and in one swing of his club sent it as a splintering mass to the ground. Ra confronted this giant, flying around his face like an insect, ordering him to get back in line and to remember his allegiance. Finally, the giant grabbed Ra in one of his great hands and stared him in the face, saying, "You promised us none of us would be hurt." Then he took the dragon's wings in his fingertips and ripped them off, throwing the wingless dragon to the ground. Seeing the chaos and perceiving that the battle was lost, many of the mercenaries began to break rank. Sanballat, however, was able to rally enough men around himself to push forward. Joab sounded the retreat, and his army turned back into the castle walls. As the whole mass of people now surged forward, Reuben waited. Gideon remained outside the walls, along with about a third of the king's army, but even as they waited, enemy soldiers charged into the courtyard. Reuben's men turned their bows inwards and began firing inside the courtyard. They had considerable advantage inside, but they were quickly becoming outnumbered. The guards and the police effectively kept the enemy contained to the courtyard while the battle waged on. Finally, Reuben could wait no longer. He closed the metal gate, leaving Gideon and nearly 50 soldiers outside the walls. A similar number of mercenaries were trapped inside the walls. Surrounded and seeing themselves completely outnumbered, Those inside the walls surrendered their weapons and were taken prisoner. Meanwhile, outside the walls, the mercenaries continued their attack. Gideon fought valiantly, but he saw his men fall on each side. There seemed to be no end to Sanballat's men. He suddenly heard a thud, and there was a bright flash, and then there was darkness.